Radji Beach, Bangka Island, February 16, 1942. A young Australian Army nurse is floating face down in the surf, pretending to be dead. A bullet has just passed completely through her body. By chance alone, it missed every organ that would have killed her. 21 of her fellow nurses are dead in the water around her. They did not pretend. They did not need to. Her name is Vivian Bullwinkel. She is 26 years old. In the next 3.5 years, she will become the only living witness to one of the most documented and, for decades, one of the most carefully suppressed war crimes of the entire Pacific War. And she will carry that knowledge in total secrecy inside a prisoner of war camp, knowing that if her captors ever learned what she knew, they would kill her instantly. This is not a story about a battle. It is the story of 22 women who went into the water together, and the one who came out, and what she did with it with the rest of her life. Because of it. 21 Australian Army nurses and 1 British civilian woman were murdered on Radji Beach that morning. Of the larger group who had surrendered alongside them, as many as 60 Australian and British servicemen and merchant sailors, only 3 other people survived. An American civilian named Eric German, a British Royal Navy stoker named Ernest Lloyd, and a British soldier named Private Cecil Kingsley, who died of his wounds 12 days later. It was never reported at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal that most of the nurses had been sexually assaulted before they were killed. Vivian Bullwinkel knew. She was told, directly, by her own government, not to speak of it. For decades, the full truth of what happened on that beach existed only in the silence of the one woman who had survived to witness it. To understand how a group of Australian Army nurses ended up stranded on a beach in the Dutch East Indies in the first place, you have to go back 4 days earlier, to the last night Singapore was still in Allied hands, and a decision that, in hindsight, none of the women involved had any way of knowing was already too late to make safely. If accounts like this, real, documented, and largely missing from popular World War II history, matter to you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Vivian Bullwinkel spent 3.5 years carrying a secret that could have gotten her killed the moment anyone discovered she knew it. 21 women are alive in this story right now. Stay with them. Vivian Bullwinkel was born on the 18th of December 1915 in Kapunda, South Australia. She trained as a nurse and midwife in New South Wales, and in 1941, with the war already underway, she tried to enlist with the Royal Australian Air Force. She was rejected. The reason given was flat feet. She did not stop there. She volunteered instead with the Australian Army Nursing Service, was accepted, and was posted to the newly formed 213th Australian General Hospital. In September 1941, she and the rest of the unit traveled to Singapore. By January 1942, Japanese forces had swept down the Malayan Peninsula with alarming speed and were closing in on Singapore itself. Reports had already reached Allied command of British nursing staff being raped and murdered by Japanese soldiers during the fall of Hong Kong the previous month. On the night of February 12, 1942, just 3 days before Singapore formally surrendered, a small steamship called the SS Vyner Brooke prepared to make a final, desperate run for safety. Built to carry 12 passengers, it sailed that night with at least 181 people aboard, by some estimates more than 300. 65 Australian Army nurses, including Vivian Bullwinkel, were among them. One of those nurses, Sister Betty Jeffrey, wrote in her diary that night about the wounded men they had to leave behind on the docks. Quote, "We just had to walk out on those super fellows lying there, not one complaining, and all needed attention. Just had to walk out on them, the rottenest thing I've ever done in my life." End quote. Sister Betty Jeffrey, diary entry, February 12, 1942. As the Vyner Brooke pulled away that night, the nurses could see fires burning along the entire Singapore coastline behind them. Betty Jeffrey called leaving wounded men behind on the docks the rottenest thing she had ever done in her life, even though there was no other choice available to her. What do you think it does to a person to be forced into a decision they will call the worst thing they've ever done, while knowing at the same time that there was genuinely no better option?
For 2 days, the Vyner Brooke's captain attempted to evade detection, hiding behind small islands in the strait between Sumatra and Bangka Island. Of the 47 ships that had fled Singapore in those final chaotic days, only 5 would make it to safety. The Vyner Brooke was not one of them. At 2 p.m. on February 14th, Japanese aircraft found the ship in open water and attacked. It took 3 direct bomb hits. The captain gave the order to abandon ship, sending civilians over the side first. Then, the Japanese aircraft came back and strafed the lifeboats and the people now swimming in open water. Vivian Bullwinkel made it to the surface and held on to the side of a lifeboat, eventually drifting ashore on Bangka Island. Survivors continued washing up throughout that night and the following day, some after as long as 65 hours adrift in the water. By the morning of February 16th, approximately 80 survivors had gathered on a stretch of sand known as Radji Beach. Wounded men, civilians, and just 22 of the 65 Australian nurses who had left Singapore on the Vyner Brooke. That night, the group watched a naval gun battle taking place out at sea. Soon after, another lifeboat reached the beach, carrying roughly 20 British soldiers. There was fresh water on the beach. There was no food. Children among the survivors were crying from hunger. 80 survivors washed up on a beach with no food, including children, after surviving a bombing, a sinking, and hours adrift in open water, and their next decision was simply to wait and hope. What do you think it takes to hold a group like that together, calmly enough to function after everything they had already survived just to reach the sand? 22 Australian nurses are alive on that beach right now in this story. They do not yet know what is coming. If this account is holding your attention the way it should, subscribe now and stay through to the end. What happened next and what it took for the truth to ever be told is the reason this story still matters 80 years later.
February 16, 1942. A search party sent out from the beach found a nearby village. The villagers, terrified of what the occupying Japanese forces might do in reprisal, urged the survivors to surrender rather than try to hide or flee. The group on the beach made a decision that by every standard of the laws of war then in force should have been the safe one. A delegation was sent to formally contact the Japanese and arrange for the entire group, wounded men, nurses, civilians, to be taken as properly treated prisoners of war. All but one of the civilian women, a British woman, went with that group toward the nearby town to surrender. The 22 nurses stayed behind on the beach with the most severely wounded men to keep caring for them until the Japanese arrived to take the whole group into custody. They were following the rules of war exactly as they were supposed to work. They surrendered correctly. It did not save them. A party of Japanese soldiers arrived at Radji Beach a few hours later. The Japanese soldiers separated the group. The wounded men were marched along the beach and killed by bayonet and gunfire. The 22 nurses and the 1 British civilian woman who had stayed were left together. Historical research conducted decades later by historian Lynette Silver, broadcaster Tess Lawrence, and biographer Barbara Angle, and published in 1919, found documented evidence that most of the nurses were sexually assaulted by the Japanese soldiers before what happened next. Vivian Bullwinkel knew this had happened. After the war, she was instructed by the Australian government not to speak about it publicly. That instruction held, in effect, for decades. A Japanese officer then ordered the 22 nurses and the 1 British civilian woman to walk into the sea. A machine gun was set up on the beach. When the women were roughly waist-deep in the water, the Japanese soldiers opened fire on them from behind. Vivian Bullwinkel was struck by a single bullet that passed through her body completely, missing every organ that would have killed her. She floated in the surf and feigned death until the Japanese soldiers withdrew from the beach. 21 of the women who walked into that water with her did not survive. Vivian Bullwinkel had to lie motionless in the water, badly wounded, surrounded by the bodies of 21 women she knew personally, while the soldiers who had just killed them sat down nearby to clean their weapons. There is no question that does justice to that. We are simply going to say their names mattered. And continue. Once the Japanese soldiers had gone, Vivian Bullwinkel found a British soldier, Private Cecil Kingsley of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, who had also survived the killing of the men on the beach. He was severely wounded. She hid with him for 12 days, tending to his injuries, before the extent of her own gunshot wound forced her to seek help. Kingsley died shortly after they were both eventually taken into Japanese custody, from a gunshot wound to his abdomen. Bullwinkel was taken to a prisoner of war camp. She wore a water bottle on her hip for the rest of her captivity, specifically to hide the scar from her wound, because if her captors realized she had a bullet wound consistent with surviving a massacre they had carried out and meant to leave no witnesses to, she would very likely have been killed immediately. Inside the camp, she was reunited with other surviving nurses from the Vyner Brooke who had been captured separately and never made it to Radji Beach at all. She told them what had happened. None of them spoke of it again for the rest of the war, for fear that doing so would put Bullwinkel, the one witness who could prove what had happened, in further danger. She spent 3.5 years as a prisoner of war, alongside nurses including Betty Jeffrey, Wilma Oram, and Margaret Dryburgh, the eldest of the group, who died in captivity at age 54. Of 65 nurses, 24 came home. For 3.5 years, Vivian Bullwinkel carried the knowledge of exactly what happened to 21 of her colleagues in total secrecy inside a camp where discovery meant her own death, and the other surviving nurses who knew her secret chose silence too, specifically to protect her. What do you think a community like that, built entirely on protecting one woman's survival, actually requires of the people inside it? What you are watching is drawn entirely from documented historical record, official military history, war crimes tribunal testimony, and decades of subsequent research. If this has given you a fuller picture of what these women survived, subscribe and share it with someone who would value it. What Vivian did with this knowledge after the war is the reason this story is remembered at all.
Vivian Bullwinkel was liberated from captivity in September 1945 alongside the other surviving nurses. She testified to the Australian War Crimes Board of Inquiry that same year and gave evidence at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, in 1946. The Japanese unit responsible for the massacre was identified as the 229th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Iwabuchi. Both Iwabuchi and his immediate subordinates were killed later in the war in heavy fighting elsewhere. 3 Japanese soldiers specifically suspected by Australian war crimes investigators of having directly committed the massacre survived the war: Captain Masaru Orita, Lieutenant Masayuki Takeuchi, and Sergeant Major Taro Kato. Takeuchi and Kato were located and detained in Malaya and New Guinea respectively. Orita, who had since been promoted to major and transferred to fight against Soviet forces in Manchuria, could not initially be located in post-war Soviet custody. According to the Australian government's own later acknowledgement, the perpetrators of the Bangka Island massacre ultimately escaped any formal punishment for the crime. 21 women were murdered. No one was ever convicted for it.
Vivian Bullwinkel retired from the Australian Army in 1947 with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and became Director of Nursing at the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital in Melbourne. She devoted much of the rest of her life to the nursing profession and to making sure the 21 women murdered alongside her on Radji Beach were never forgotten, raising funds for a nurses' memorial, helping found the Australian Nurses Memorial Centre, and serving for years on the Council of the Australian War Memorial. In 1977, she married Colonel Francis West Statham, becoming Vivian Statham. In 1992, she returned to Bangka Island in person to unveil a shrine to the nurses who had not survived. She died of a heart attack on the 3rd of July, 2000, in Perth, Western Australia. She was 84 years old. In 2022, on the 80th anniversary of the massacre, the Australian College of Nursing Foundation announced a scholarship in the name of each of the 21 nurses who died and led the fundraising for a sculpture of Vivian Bullwinkel at the Australian War Memorial. She became the first woman honored there with a dedicated statue.
The evidence of the sexual assaults she had been instructed to stay silent about for most of her life was not formally and publicly reported until 1919, 19 years after her death, when historians finally uncovered and published what she had carried, mostly alone, for over half a century. She is quoted in a later interview explaining simply why she had volunteered to be a nurse in a war zone in the first place. "I felt if my friends were willing to go and fight for their country, then they deserved the best care we could give them." 22 women walked into the water. One came out and made sure the world eventually knew all their names. If this told you something about these women that you didn't know before today, say one of their names in the comments if you remember it, or say Vivian Bullwinkel's. There were 22 women on that beach. They deserve to be more than a statistic in a story about a war crime that took nearly 80 years to be fully told. No manufactured urgency here. If this gave you something worth knowing, the useful thing to do is simple. Subscribe so the next one of these reaches you, and share this with someone who would value it. Vivian Bullwinkel spent the rest of her life making sure 21 women were remembered. The least this channel can do is help that work continue. That is the whole ask.